All right, so let's look at this rhetorical analysis prompt. It was the first rhetorical analysis prompt that you wrote on this week for your 2 essays. Okay, so I'm going to walk through this. Feel free to follow along, use your own document to follow along with me, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better understanding of the strategies that were used in this particular essay, or I should say speech. All right, so let's look at context. First, I'm going to read this context that is provided extremely carefully. On January 21st, 2009, then Representative John Lewis addressed the United States House of Representatives in support of a resolution calling on Americans to advance the legacy of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. Lewis had worked alongside King in the civil rights movement to end legal discrimination and secure equal rights for African Americans in the U.S. The following is an excerpt from his speech. Read the passage carefully, then write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices Lewis makes to convey his message about the importance of MLK's legacy. Okay, so follow along for me. As I read this prompt, I'm thinking to myself, House Representative Speaker John Lewis, Speaker, addresses the United States House of Representatives. Audience. Okay. Calling on Americans to advance the legacy of civil rights leader. All right, so let's do a triangle. Speaker is Lewis. Audience, so he's specifically talking to the House of Representatives. We have to ask ourselves, is that who he's targeting? We'll come back to it. Message. Do we know the message yet? Well, the prompt kind of says that MLK's legacy is important. We have to read the text first, though, I think. And purpose. It also kind of alludes to the purpose here, but we need to, I think, read the text. Context. What context is provided in the actual contextual information of the prompt? It's 2009. John Lewis was a House of Representatives representative back then. If you know anything about Lewis, he died in 2020. I think that was this year. What a year. Okay. Some other contextual information that's in the prompt. Lewis worked with MLK quite a bit. All of this is found directly up here in the contextual information. If you move too quick and you don't read the context correctly, carefully, it's kind of like a puzzle. Pull from it what you can. Pull from it what's there that you don't really have to think about much. Okay, so let's read the text. Okay, I'm going to read it. I'm going to pause periodically, and we're going to analyze what's happening in it. Martin Luther King Jr. was a man I knew personally and regarded as a brother, friend, colleague, a prophet, my hero, and just a simple human being filled with love, peace, and compassion for all of humankind. So in this first paragraph, or I should say how he knew. In this first paragraph, he's introducing how he knew MLK. I will never forget my first impression of him. As a Black child growing up in the heart of rural Alabama, I tasted the bitter fruits of segregation and racial discrimination, and I didn't like it. I saw the signs that, quote, white men, colored men, white women, colored women, white waiting, colored waiting. I used to ask my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, why segregation? Why racial discrimination? They said, that's the way it is. Don't get in trouble. Don't get in the way. So this paragraph is talking about John Lewis's experience as a child, and that he started questioning the system, but people older than him just said, this is the way it is. How sad. My goodness. Third paragraph. But one day when I was only 15 years old, I heard the voice of Martin Luther King Jr. on an old radio. He was talking about the discipline and the philosophy of nonviolence. He was talking about the Montgomery bus boycott and the ability of a committed and determined people to make a difference in our society. I felt like he was talking directly to me, saying, John Lewis, you too can make a difference in our society. This paragraph is big. I think this paragraph is talking about John Lewis's first meeting or learning of MLK. And it inspired him. Obviously, it inspired him. This is the first time he'd heard of MLK. He was 15. He heard about the bus boycotts. He was inspired by MLK to question what was going on in the world, why the discrimination, and perhaps what he could do. He could make a difference. This next paragraph is big as well for rhetorical strategies. In 1958, at the age of 18, I traveled from Troy to Montgomery to meet with him and Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and that was the beginning of a long and beautiful relationship. After that, our paths would cross often in the sit-ins during the Freedom Rides in 1961, the year Barack Obama was born, as a board member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, his organization, organizing the 1963 March on Washington and in Mississippi during the summer of 1964. In the march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965, at the Riverside Church in New York in 1967, Mr. Chairman, when you spoke out against the war in Vietnam. In preparation for its ultimate course, the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, when he was planning to come to Washington. So what is happening here? This is his first in-person meeting with MLK. This is a big deal. In this paragraph, he meets Martin Luther King Jr. And the rest of this paragraph is big because it talks about the number of meetings over the years, and it explains them. It's hard to read out loud, you'll notice, because the semicolons indicate different situations. The commas are just details, so I didn't read that super great. But for example, during the Freedom Rides in 1961, the year that Obama was born, that's one entity. So this is a lot of different times when the two of them met up at different racial inequality events. That's a big deal. I would say this is a big strategy that could potentially be analyzed in a rhetorical analysis essay. It lists all the times that these two met up, starting when Lewis was only 18 years old. So it only took 3 years from when he first heard about MLK to meet him in person and start doing his work with him. Okay, next paragraph. As I grew to know Dr. King and the life of the movement, my admiration for the man also grew. He was a spokesperson, not just for Blacks, but for all of those who had been left out and left behind. He spoke to the hearts and consciences of all of us who believed nonviolence and love offer a more excellent way. This good man, this God-fearing man, gave us hope in a time of hopelessness. This good man, man of God, this son of America, this citizen of the world, produced light in dark places. Martin Luther King Jr. had the ability to bring the dirt and the filth from under the American rug, out of the cracks and the corners, into the open light in order for us to deal with it. Martin Luther King Jr., more than any other American in the 20th century, had the power to bring people together, more people together, to do good, Black and white, rich and poor, young and old, Protestant, Catholic, Jews. His message was love, and his weapon was truth. His message was creative nonviolence. His goal was the beloved community, a community of justice, a community at peace with itself, with himself. So these two paragraphs, or maybe these three paragraphs even, I think in these paragraphs, John Lewis is starting to introduce, I think, Martin Luther King and his strengths, what he did for people, the effect of his actions on the world, on blacks, whites, on all kinds of people. I think this is where he's really starting to get into the meat here of his message. This man that I marched with, worked with, went to jail with, this man that I got to know was so sensitive and so caring. He personified the very best of humankind. He was a gentleman who used the teaching of the great teacher and the tools of Gandhi. In a sense, he spoke a strange language, the philosophy of passive resistance to evil and the use of nonviolence in the struggle for good. In a sense, he was a radical, far too advanced in his concepts of love and peace for the violent times in which he lived. I think that's super interesting that Lewis calls him radical. This was in 2009, right? John Lewis calls Martin Luther King Jr. From the 50s and 60s radical. And I think if you pause for a second, MLK was super radical. I think at the time when it was just accepted, as we can see here previously, that his parents, grandparents, great-grandparents said, it's just the way it is. Martin Luther King was radical and said, heck no, this is not the way it should be. And so he used passive resistance and nonviolence to fight for something he really believed in, something that he felt should be the norm. Dr. King taught us that the method of nonviolence was the key to building a beloved community, a society based on simple justice that values the dignity and worth of every human being. I say to you, my friends, audience, 41 years ago, Martin Luther King was taken from us by an assassin's bullet. But murder could not kill the dream of peace. It could not kill the dream of an open society. It could not kill the dream of a beloved community. The movement that Martin Luther King Jr. led, the movement that he sustained, was too necessary, too noble, too right to ever die. We know that his voice is stilled today, but perhaps more than ever, we know that his message still rings in the hearts of America. 40 years later, we must rededicate ourselves to the struggle that was his struggle and continue to seek the goals that were his goals. Here at the very end, this is a call to action. And so this call to action, you have to question and say, well, who is he calling to action? I believe that his audience here, the targeted audience, is the House of Representatives. Back then, now in 2009, and even still now, the House of Representative meetings, sessions were recorded, and the common person could absolutely watch them. But MLK is speaking directly to the House of Representatives. He says earlier in here, he calls them friends. He reminds them of the goal, which is to, or the purpose of his speech, which is really, in my opinion, to remind these individuals of MLK's legacy, to persuade them to continue his work and his legacy, and to not fall prey to these sorts of discriminatory actions that were so prevalent during Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. And so I believe that his targeted audience is the House of Representatives. Perhaps you could go a little bit more narrow, because there are a lot of people in the House of Representatives, and say anyone who, perhaps any of the House of Representatives members who perhaps has forgotten this message of equality, or anyone who argues for any sort of discrimination within the House of Representatives, if you really wanted to get more narrow. So if we come back then to our triangle, I think his purpose here is to remind about MLK's legacy and goals. And I also think it's to persuade the House of Representatives individuals to continue MLK's work. And so what is his message then? What is he trying to communicate? The main idea here is that MLK is a hero. MLK is awesome. MLK's work is noteworthy of being continued.